The bear's presence had become a constant in Dan's life, an unsettling reminder that something was amiss. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the massive creature would emerge from the shadows of the forest, its dark eyes fixed upon the house. It stood motionless, unblinking, as if keeping watch over a secret that Dan had yet to uncover. At first, Dan had dismissed the bear's presence as a mere curiosity, a quirk of nature that he had grown accustomed to. But as the weeks wore on, a sense of unease began to grow within him. The bear's unwavering gaze seemed to pierce through the walls of his home, penetrating the very core of his being. He found himself spending more and more time indoors, peering out at the bear from behind the safety of his curtains. The once familiar rooms of his house began to feel claustrophobic, as if the walls were slowly closing in around him. The tension in the air was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed down upon his shoulders. As he watched the bear from his window, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was trying to tell him something, to warn him of a danger that lay hidden within the depths of his own home. The thought gnawed at him, a constant presence in the back of his mind that he couldn't quite shake. One evening, as the bear stood in its usual spot, Dan decided that he could no longer ignore the growing sense of unease that had taken root within him. He had to know what was causing the bear to keep its nightly vigil, what secret it seemed to be guarding. With a deep breath, he stepped away from the window and made his way towards the basement, a place he rarely ventured. The stairs creaked beneath his feet, a sound that echoed through the stillness of the house. The air grew colder as he descended, a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. The basement was a maze of shadows and forgotten relics, a testament to the years that had passed since he had last set foot within its confines. Dan swept his flashlight across the room, the beam of light illuminating the dusty corners and cobweb-covered walls. And then he saw them, the deep scratches that marred the surface of the walls. They were unlike anything he had ever seen before, too large and too precise to have been made by any animal that he knew of. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, a feeling of dread that he couldn't quite shake. As he moved deeper into the basement, Dan's flashlight fell upon a sight that made his blood run cold. There, in the far corner of the room, lay a trapdoor, half hidden beneath a pile of old boxes and forgotten furniture. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The trapdoor seemed to beckon to him, a silent invitation to uncover the secrets that lay hidden beneath. With trembling hands, he reached out and grasped the handle, the metal cold and unyielding beneath his fingers. As he lifted the trapdoor, a musty smell assailed his nostrils, a scent of decay and neglect that made his stomach turn. But it was the sight that lay beyond that made him recoil in horror, his eyes widening in disbelief. There, in the dim light of his flashlight, lay a pile of bones, human and animal alike. They were arranged in a haphazard manner, as if they had been carelessly tossed aside. And in the center of it all, glinting in the beam of light, was a mirror, cracked and tarnished, with strange symbols etched into its surface. The realization of what he had stumbled upon hit Dan like a ton of bricks, a sickening feeling of dread that settled in the pit of his stomach. The bones, the mirror, the bear's nightly vigil, it all made a twisted sort of sense, a macabre puzzle that he had inadvertently stumbled upon. He backed away from the trapdoor, his heart pounding in his ears. The bear's presence suddenly took on a new meaning, a warning that he had failed to heed. It had been trying to protect him, to keep him away from the horrors that lay hidden beneath his own home. Dan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had discovered. The mirror seemed to be the key to it all, a portal to a world that he couldn't begin to comprehend. The symbols etched into its surface were unlike anything he had ever seen before, a language that he couldn't decipher. He knew that he should have run, should have fled the basement and never looked back. But a morbid curiosity had taken hold of him, a need to understand the secrets that lay hidden within the mirror's depths. And so, with a trembling hand, he reached out and touched its surface, the glass cold and unyielding beneath his fingertips. In the days that followed his discovery, Dan found himself consumed by the need to unravel the mysteries that lay hidden within the mirror's depths. He spent long hours in the basement, studying the symbols etched into its surface, trying to make sense of their meaning. He pored over ancient texts and online forums, seeking out any information that might shed light on the mirror's origins. But the more he learned, the more he realized just how little he truly understood. The mirror seemed to be a relic from a time long past, an artifact of a world that he couldn't begin to comprehend. As he delved deeper into his research, Dan began to notice changes within himself. He became withdrawn and distant, losing interest in the things that had once brought him joy. His sleep was plagued by nightmares, visions of twisted creatures and dark realms that seemed to beckon to him from beyond the mirror's surface. But still, he couldn't bring himself to stop, couldn't tear himself away from the secrets that lay hidden within the basement. The mirror had a hold on him, a power that he couldn't resist, and so he continued to study it, to unravel its mysteries, even as he felt himself slipping further and further away from the world he had once known. As the weeks turned into months, Dan's obsession with the mirror began to take its toll. He lost weight, his once healthy frame becoming gaunt and hollow. His eyes took on a haunted look, as if he had seen things that no mortal man was meant to see. He stopped answering phone calls and emails, cutting himself off from the outside world. His days were spent in the basement, surrounded by the bones and the mirror, lost in a world of his own making. But even as he lost himself in his research, Dan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The bear's presence had become a constant in his life, a silent guardian that kept watch over him from the edge of the forest. He began to wonder if the bear was more than just a creature of flesh and blood, if it was somehow connected to the mirror and the secrets that lay hidden within its depths. The thought both terrified and thrilled him, a tantalizing possibility that he couldn't quite bring himself to accept. One night, as Dan sat in the basement, lost in his thoughts, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The growl grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from all around him. And then he saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows, its form twisted and grotesque. It was the bear, but not as he had ever seen it before. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, its fur matted and bloody. It lumbered towards him, its mouth opening to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. Dan scrambled to his feet, his mind reeling with terror. He backed away from the creature, his eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The bear had him cornered, trapped in the very place that he had once considered his sanctuary. In that moment, as he stared into the face of certain death, Dan's mind seemed to clear. He realized, with a sudden clarity, that the mirror had been controlling him all along, twisting his thoughts and desires to its own dark ends. He looked down at the pile of bones that lay scattered at his feet, and he saw them for what they truly were, the remains of those who had come before him, those who had fallen victim to the mirror's dark power. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. With a sudden burst of strength, he lunged for the mirror, his hands closing around its tarnished frame. He lifted it high above his head, his muscles straining with the effort. The bear let out a roar of rage, its eyes blazing with fury. But Dan didn't falter. With a final, desperate cry, he brought the mirror crashing down upon the floor, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The effect was immediate. The bear let out a howl of pain, its form twisting and contorting as if it were being torn apart from the inside out. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting like living things. Dan watched in horror as the bear's form began to dissolve, its flesh melting away to reveal the bones beneath. The creature let out a final, agonized cry, and then it was gone, leaving nothing but a pile of dust in its wake. The room was silent, the only sound the pounding of Dan's heart in his ears. He looked down at the shattered remains of the mirror, and he saw that the symbols that had once adorned its surface were gone, replaced by nothing but smooth, unblemished glass. And in that moment, he knew that it was over. The mirror's hold on him had been broken, its dark power vanquished. He was free to live his life as he saw fit, free to embrace the world that he had once turned his back on. In the days that followed, Dan set about putting his life back together. He cleaned out the basement, disposing of the bones and the shattered remains of the mirror. He opened the curtains and let the sunlight stream in, chasing away the shadows that had once haunted his home. He reached out to old friends and family, apologizing for his absence and his strange behavior. He told them the truth, or at least as much of it as he could bear to share. Some of them understood, while others looked at him with pity or confusion. But Dan didn't let their reactions deter him. He knew that he had been given a second chance, a chance to live his life on his own terms. And he was determined to make the most of it. He started spending more time outdoors, taking long walks in the forest that surrounded his home. He found solace in the beauty of nature, in the simple pleasures of the world around him. And as he walked, he would sometimes catch a glimpse of the bear, watching him from the shadows of the trees. But now he saw it in a different light. He saw it as a guardian, a protector, a symbol of the strength and resilience that he had found within himself. As the weeks turned into months, Dan found himself growing stronger, both in body and in mind. He took up new hobbies, explored new interests, and made new friends. He started writing again, pouring his heart and soul into the pages of a novel that he had always dreamed of writing. The words flowed from his pen like water, a cathartic release of all the emotions that he had kept bottled up for so long. And as he wrote, he found himself thinking more and more about the bear, about the role that it had played in his life. He realized that, in a strange way, the creature had been his savior, guiding him towards a truth that he had been too blind to see. He knew that he would never forget the horrors that he had witnessed, the darkness that he had faced. But he also knew that those experiences had made him stronger, had given him a new perspective on the world around him. One evening, as Dan sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. He turned his head, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the bear emerge from the shadows. But this time he didn't feel fear or dread. Instead, he felt a sense of calm, a quiet acceptance of the creature's presence. He watched as the bear lumbered towards him, its eyes filled with a quiet intelligence. And then, to his surprise, the bear spoke. Its voice was deep and rumbling, like the sound of distant thunder. "You have done well," it said, its words echoing in Dan's mind. "You have faced your demons and emerged stronger for it." Dan nodded, his eyes filling with tears. He knew that the bear was right, that he had indeed faced his demons and come out on the other side. And he knew that he had the creature to thank for it, for guiding him towards the truth that he had been too afraid to face. From that day forward, Dan's life was never the same. He continued to write, to explore, to live his life to the fullest. And always, the bear was there, watching over him from the shadows. He knew that there would be other challenges to face, other obstacles to overcome. But he also knew that he was stronger now, that he had the courage and the resilience to face whatever life threw his way. And so, he embraced each day as it came, with a newfound sense of purpose and determination. He knew that he had been given a second chance, a chance to make a difference in the world around him. And he was determined to make the most of it. Years later, as Dan sat by the fireplace in his home, surrounded by the warmth and love of his family, he found himself thinking back on the events of that fateful night, the night that had changed his life forever. He knew that he would never forget the horrors that he had witnessed, the darkness that he had faced. But he also knew that those experiences had made him the man he was today, had given him the strength and the courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And as he looked out the window, he saw the bear, standing at the edge of the forest, its eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. He knew that the creature would always be there, watching over him, guiding him towards the truth that he needed to hear. And so, with a smile on his face and a heart full of gratitude, Dan turned back to his family, ready to embrace whatever the future had in store. He had faced his demons and emerged stronger for it. And he knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would always have the strength and the courage to face them head-on. The seasons changed, and with them, Dan's relationship with the bear evolved. As winter descended upon the forest, blanketing the trees in snow and ice, Dan found himself venturing out more frequently, drawn to the quiet solitude that the cold months brought. One December evening, as the snow fell in gentle flakes around him, Dan spotted the bear's massive form trudging through the drifts. Without hesitation, he followed, his boots crunching in the fresh powder. The bear led him deeper into the forest than he had ever ventured before, to a clearing where the moonlight cast an ethereal glow upon the untouched snow. "There are others," the bear rumbled, its breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Others who have found mirrors like yours." Dan's heart quickened. "Other mirrors? Other guardians?" The bear nodded its massive head. "The mirrors are ancient, crafted in a time when the veil between worlds was thinner. They seek vessels, humans whose minds they can corrupt and control. But why? What do they want?" "To open doorways," the bear said, its eyes reflecting the moonlight. "To allow things from beyond to enter this world." Dan shuddered, remembering the nightmares that had plagued him during his obsession with the mirror. "And you? What are you really?" The bear seemed to smile, though its face remained unchanged. "We are guardians, as old as the mirrors themselves. For every mirror, there is one of us, bound to protect the innocent from their influence." As they stood in the clearing, Dan noticed strange markings in the snow, symbols that reminded him of those etched on the mirror. "These markings. A warning," the bear growled. "Another mirror has been found. Another guardian awakened." Over the following months, Dan began to document everything the bear told him. He filled notebooks with the bear's stories, tales of ancient battles between guardians and mirrors, of humans who had fallen prey to the mirror's influence and those who had been saved. In early spring, as the first flowers began to bloom in the forest, the bear brought Dan to a small cabin nestled among the trees. "She lives here," the bear said. "Another who broke free." Dan approached the cabin cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. When he knocked on the door, it was opened by a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held the same haunted look he sometimes saw in his own reflection. "I'm Elizabeth," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "And you must be the one Ursa told me about." "Ursa, your guardian," Elizabeth said, gesturing toward the window where Dan could see the bear waiting patiently outside. "Mine is a hawk. She watches from above." As they shared tea by the fireplace, Elizabeth told Dan her story. How she had found a mirror in the attic of her childhood home, how it had consumed her thoughts and nearly driven her to madness, and how the hawk had led her to break its hold. "We're not alone," Elizabeth said, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "There's a network of us, survivors who've broken free. We help each other, and we look for signs of new mirrors surfacing." Dan leaned forward, intrigued. "How many of us are there?" "Dozens scattered across the country. Some have formed small communities, living together for protection and support. Others, like me, prefer solitude." She reached for a worn leather journal on the coffee table. "This contains locations, names, contact information. We keep it updated, pass it around." As Dan flipped through the journal, he recognized some of the symbols from his own mirror. "These markings. A language older than humanity," Elizabeth explained. "The guardians have taught some of us to read it. It warns of the mirror's locations, their powers, their histories." When Dan left Elizabeth's cabin that evening, the bear, Ursa, was waiting for him. "Now you understand," it said. "You're part of something greater." That night, Dan dreamed of dark forests and shattered glass, of bears and hawks and other creatures standing watch over sleeping towns. He woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since breaking free from the mirror's influence. Over the next year, Dan traveled across the country, meeting others like himself and Elizabeth. In Seattle, he met twins who had simultaneously broken free from a mirror they'd found in an antique shop, their guardian a massive elk that roamed the nearby mountains. In New Orleans, he stayed with a community of 5 survivors whose guardians were various swamp creatures: alligators, herons, and snapping turtles. Each survivor had their own story, their own trauma, but they all shared the same haunted look in their eyes. the same understanding of what it meant to have faced something beyond human comprehension and survived. During his travels, Dan learned more about the mirror's origins. They were created thousands of years ago by an ancient civilization that sought to harness the power of other dimensions. The guardians had been summoned by shamans who foresaw the danger and bound these protective spirits to watch over the mirrors for eternity. When Dan returned home after months of travel, he found Ursa waiting for him at the edge of the forest. "You've changed," the bear observed. Dan nodded. "I understand my purpose now." He set about converting his basement, once a place of darkness and obsession, into a center of knowledge. He hung maps marking the locations of known mirrors, pinned photographs of survivors and their guardians, and filled bookshelves with journals documenting everything he had learned. Late one autumn night, as Dan sat by his fireplace transcribing notes, Ursa appeared at his window, more agitated than he had ever seen the guardian. "What is it?" Dan asked, opening the door to the cold night air. "A new mirror has surfaced," Ursa growled. "Close by. Its guardian is weak, unable to protect its human." Dan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze. "Where?" "The old Miller property, just beyond the ridge. A young woman has moved in, unaware of what waits in the walls." Without hesitation, Dan grabbed his coat and a backpack containing the tools he'd assembled for just such an occasion: salt, iron filings, and a journal containing the incantations Elizabeth had taught him. As they made their way through the darkened forest, Ursa explained that the mirror had been sealed within the walls of the house decades ago by a previous survivor, but recent renovations had exposed it once more. "Its guardian is a fox," Ursa said, "old and weary from centuries of vigilance. It may not have the strength to fight much longer." When they reached the Miller property, Dan saw lights burning in every window of the old Victorian house. Through the glass, he could make out a figure pacing frantically from room to room. "She's already feeling its influence," Ursa warned. "We must hurry." Dan approached the front door and knocked firmly. When it opened, he found himself face to face with a young woman whose eyes darted nervously behind him, as if searching for something in the darkness. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice strained. "My name is Dan," he said calmly. "I think you might be in danger, and I'm here to help." The woman, Sarah, she later told him, had moved into the house just 2 weeks prior. Almost immediately, she'd begun experiencing strange phenomena. Whispers in empty rooms, reflections that moved independently of her, and increasingly vivid nightmares. "There's something in the walls," she whispered, leading Dan to the living room where renovation work had exposed the lathe and plaster. "I can hear it calling to me." Dan saw it immediately, a glint of tarnished silver behind the broken wall, symbols identical to those that had once adorned his own mirror etched into its surface. And curled beside it, nearly transparent in its weakness, was a small red fox, its eyes glazed with exhaustion. "The guardian," Dan murmured, pointing to the fox. "Do you see it?" Sarah squinted, then gasped. "I've been dreaming about a fox for days. It's been trying to warn me, hasn't it?" Over the next several hours, Dan explained everything to Sarah, about the mirrors, the guardians, and the network of survivors. Together, they carefully extracted the mirror from the wall, making sure not to touch its surface directly. As dawn broke, they built a fire in the backyard and performed the ritual Elizabeth had documented in her journal. As the mirror melted in the flames, the fox guardian seemed to grow more substantial, its form strengthening as the mirror's power waned. "Thank you," it said, its voice a soft, melodic sound unlike Ursa's rumbling growl. "I have watched over this mirror for 300 years. Now I can rest." In the weeks that followed, Sarah became the newest member of their network. The fox, though freed from its duty to the mirror, chose to remain with her, becoming her guardian just as Ursa had become Dan's. As winter approached once more, Dan expanded his basement headquarters to accommodate regular meetings of survivors from the surrounding states. They gathered to share information, support one another through the lingering trauma of their experiences, and coordinate their efforts to find and destroy the remaining mirrors. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, Elizabeth arrived with urgent news. "The symbols are changing," she said, spreading ancient texts across Dan's table. The Guardians are restless. Something is coming. What do you mean, coming? Dan asked. Elizabeth's eyes met his, filled with apprehension. The mirrors were created as doorways, remember? We've been destroying them, closing those doorways. Whatever waits on the other side isn't pleased. That night, guardians from across the region gathered in the forest behind Dan's house. Bears, wolves, hawks, foxes, and creatures he couldn't name, all converging in a display unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Ursa stood at the center of the gathering, its massive form towering over many of the other guardians. The Ancient Ones stir, it announced, its voice carrying through the silent forest. Those who created the mirrors seek new ways to enter our world. A chorus of growls, screeches, and howls answered this proclamation. A cacophony that made the hair on Dan's neck stand on end. What can we do? Dan asked, stepping forward. Prepare, Ursa replied simply. Gather the survivors. Strengthen your bonds with your guardians. The battle ahead will require all our strength. As the guardians dispersed back to their humans, Dan felt a weight settle upon his shoulders, a responsibility greater than any he had faced before. But as he looked at Ursa, at Elizabeth and her hawk, at Sarah and her fox, he knew they wouldn't face this challenge alone. In the days that followed, Dan threw himself into preparation. He coordinated with survivors across the country, establishing communication networks and emergency protocols. He studied the ancient texts Elizabeth had brought, learning to recognize the shifting symbols that might indicate a breach between worlds. As winter deepened, the forest around Dan's home became a gathering place for survivors and guardians alike. They came from distant cities and remote villages, drawn by dreams and the urgent promptings of their animal protectors. By the winter solstice, over 40 survivors had assembled, each accompanied by their guardian, a living bestiary of creatures both mundane and mystical. The veil thins tonight, Elizabeth explained as they gathered around a massive bonfire. The guardians believe the creators of the mirrors will attempt to forge a new connection to our world. Dan stood before the assembled group, Ursa's massive form beside him. We've all faced our personal demons through the mirrors, he said, his voice carrying through the crisp night air. Now we face something larger, the source of that corruption. Sarah stepped forward, her fox guardian weaving between her legs. But how do we fight something from another dimension? We're just people who got lucky enough to break free. That's precisely why we can fight them, Dan replied. Each of us has rejected their influence. We've seen into their world and turned away. That gives us power they don't expect. As midnight approached, the guardians grew restless. The animals paced and growled, their eyes fixed on the star-filled sky. Then, as the solstice hour struck, the air above the clearing began to shimmer and distort. It begins, Ursa rumbled. The distortion grew, stretching and twisting until it resembled a massive, inverted mirror hanging in the sky. Within its surface, shadowy figures moved elongated, writhing forms that bore little resemblance to anything human. They're searching for anchors, Elizabeth shouted over the sudden howling wind. Places where mirrors once stood. They need a foothold. Dan felt a pull toward his basement, where his mirror had once exerted its influence. Around him, he could see other survivors fighting similar urges, their faces contorted with effort. Join hands, he called out. Remember what broke your mirror's hold. The survivors formed a circle around the bonfire, their guardians forming an outer ring of protection. As they joined hands, Dan felt a surge of energy. Not the cold, insidious pull of the mirror, but something warmer, more vital. Each of us broke free through connection, he said, his voice growing stronger. Through love, through courage, through the realization that we weren't alone. That's what they can't understand. That's our weapon. Above them, the inverted mirror pulsed and distorted, the entities within it pressing against the boundary between worlds. Lightning cracked across the cloudless sky, and several survivors cried out as they felt the psychic assault of their former tormentors. Hold fast, Ursa roared, its voice joining with the other guardians in a primal chorus that shook the trees. Dan closed his eyes, focusing on the connections between them all, the shared trauma, the healing, the community they'd built from their collective suffering. He thought of the bear watching from the forest edge, of discovering the basement's secrets, of shattering the mirror and reclaiming his life. When he opened his eyes again, he saw threads of golden light flowing between the joined hands of the survivors, forming a network that mirrored the connections of their guardians. The light grew, spiraling upward toward the distortion in the sky. "It's working," Elizabeth gasped. "Keep holding on," the entities beyond the barrier shrieked, a sound that existed more in their minds than in the physical world. The distortion began to fold in upon itself, collapsing like a dying star. With a final psychic concussion that knocked several survivors to their knees, the portal closed. The night sky returned to its natural state, stars twinkling peacefully above the forest clearing. In the silence that followed, Dan helped those who had fallen to their feet. "Is everyone all right?" Sarah approached, her face pale but resolute. "Did we win? Is it over?" Ursa shook its massive head. "Not over. Changed. They will seek other ways, but this path is closed to them now." As dawn approached, the survivors gathered around the dying embers of the bonfire. Though exhausted, there was a new strength in their eyes, a confidence born of facing the source of their nightmares and standing firm. "What happens now?" someone asked. Dan looked to Ursa, who nodded its approval. "Now we build. We strengthen our network. We find others like us and bring them into the fold. And we prepare for whatever comes next." In the months that followed, Dan's home became the headquarters for what they came to call the Guardian Network. Maps on his walls tracked known mirror locations and survivor communities. Regular gatherings brought new faces and new guardians into their circle. And though they remained vigilant, watching for signs of new incursions, they also celebrated their victories and their freedom. They had faced the darkness beyond the mirror and emerged stronger for it. One spring evening, as Dan sat on his porch watching the sunset, Ursa settled beside him with a contented rumble. "No regrets?" the bear asked. Dan smiled, watching the golden light play through the new leaves. "None. Every step of this journey, even the darkest parts, led us here." "And where is here?" Dan considered the question, thinking of the community they'd built, the purpose they'd found, the connections forged through shared adversity. "Home," he said simply. "We're home. The end."